80% of China's oil passes through one 21-mile wide strait, one blockade, one economic collapse. And Beijing just deployed a counter-strategy so precise, it rewrote 50 years of Middle East power dynamics in under 6 weeks. Every dollar of gas price increase you've seen in the last month traces back to what's happening in that narrow waterway between Iran and Oman. China isn't just watching this unfold. Beijing is orchestrating moves that ensure when the Strait of Hormuz becomes a choke point, Chinese ships pass through while American vessels calculate risk. This channel operates on no corporate funding, no government backing, and no editorial pressure telling us what angles to avoid. If understanding the real architecture of global power matters to you, the kind that determines which economy survives the next energy crisis, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because what's happening in the Persian Gulf right now is not about Iran and Israel. It's about China and the United States. And most people have no idea how deep this goes. Let me show you exactly what happened. On March 11th, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi landed in Tehran. Not a video call, not a deputy minister, the top diplomat. The meeting lasted 9 hours. No major announcements followed, no joint statement, no press conference. Western media barely covered it. That silence should have been the first warning. 48 hours after Wang Yi left Tehran, Iranian naval forces began the most aggressive interdiction campaign in the Strait of Hormuz since the 1980s. Not random harassment, coordinated seizures. 12 commercial vessels detained in 14 days, all flying flags from countries that had recently voted against China in UN proceedings. Panamanian Registry, Liberian Registry, Marshall Islands. Not one Chinese-flagged vessel touched, not one delayed, not one inspected beyond standard protocol. The pattern is so clean it doesn't require speculation. Iran is operating maritime enforcement that somehow distinguishes between vessels based on their government's position toward Beijing. That level of operational coordination doesn't happen by accident. It happens when two countries share intelligence infrastructure, operational timelines, and strategic objectives. The Pentagon called this a regional dispute. The State Department issued a statement expressing concern about freedom of navigation, standard diplomatic language. But here's what the operational reality shows. U.S. Navy assets in the region have not intervened in a single interdiction. Not one boarding party challenged. Not one detained ship escorted out by American destroyers. Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain has gone quiet. The most powerful navy in human history is watching commercial vessels get seized in water it's supposed to protect, and doing nothing. Why the paralysis? Because China communicated one message with absolute clarity. Any U.S. military interference in the Strait triggers an immediate Chinese response. Not in the Gulf. In the Taiwan Strait. Beijing won't say this publicly. Washington won't admit it was said privately. But the operational behavior on both sides confirms the deal is in place. Iran controls Hormuz. The U.S. Navy stands down. And in exchange, China maintains current pressure levels around Taiwan without escalating to blockade. This is not conjecture. This is the only framework that explains why the United States, with 4 carrier strike groups theoretically available, has allowed a regional power to shut down the most strategically vital waterway in global energy without firing a single shot in response. Now let me show you the technical mechanism that makes this possible. The Strait of Hormuz is not just narrow, it's legally complex. Under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, the strait is subject to transit passage rights. Ships from any nation can pass through territorial waters without permission. But that same framework allows coastal states, in this case Iran, to enforce environmental customs and safety regulations. Iran is not blocking the strait. Legally, they can't. A full blockade would constitute an act of war and trigger immediate international response. Instead, Iran is conducting inspections, selective inspections. They board a vessel, claim to be checking for sanctions violations or environmental compliance, hold it for 72 hours, then release it. No direct combat. No sinking ships. Just bureaucratic delay backed by armed naval personnel. The genius is in the selection algorithm. Every detained vessel belongs to a country that either voted to condemn China's South China Sea claims, supported Taiwan's observer status in international organizations, or participated in Western naval exercises near Chinese waters. The message is unmistakable. Align with Washington on China issues, and your commercial fleet faces inspections, delays, and costs in the most critical energy corridor on the planet. Here's what the Pentagon is leaving out of every briefing. The United States has no legal mechanism to stop this. Iran is not blockading. They're inspecting. Under international law, coastal states have that right. The U.S. cannot use military force to prevent legal inspections without triggering a war it has spent months trying to avoid. Beijing knows this. Tehran knows this. And now they're exploiting the gap between America's legal constraints and its strategic credibility. But there's one more layer that almost nobody is discussing. The vessels being detained are not carrying oil out of the Gulf. They're carrying manufactured goods into it, Chinese exports, electronics, machinery, consumer products destined for Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar. Iran is not cutting off energy supplies to the world. Iran is cutting off everyone else's access to Gulf markets while ensuring Chinese goods flow freely. This is economic warfare disguised as maritime law enforcement, and it's working. Saudi Arabia received a quiet message 3 weeks ago. Beijing can guarantee your imports continue without disruption, or Beijing can let Tehran inspect every non-Chinese vessel entering Saudi waters, delaying deliveries, spoiling perishables, driving up your costs. The choice is yours. But the choice requires a decision about whose strategic framework you operate inside. 2 weeks after that message, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman postponed a scheduled meeting with Secretary of State Antony Blinken. No explanation given. The meeting has not been rescheduled. At the same time, Saudi Arabia announced it would participate in a Chinese-led naval exercise in the Indian Ocean, the first time the kingdom has conducted joint naval operations with China. The timing is not coincidental. Riyadh is reading the operational map, and the map shows China controlling access to the Gulf without firing a shot. Now here's the math that makes this entire strategy inevitable. China imports 3 million barrels of oil per day. 76% of that volume transits the Strait of Hormuz. That's 8 million barrels per day, moving through a waterway 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. If that strait closes, China's economy has 90 days of strategic reserves before industrial production begins shutting down. The United States imports 3 million barrels per day. Only 18% comes from the Middle East. That's 1 million barrels per day through Hormuz. America has its own production. Shale reserves, strategic petroleum reserves, Canada next door. The U.S. economy can survive a Hormuz closure for years. China's economy cannot survive it for months. This asymmetry creates the central strategic problem of the next decade. China's industrial base is more dependent on Middle Eastern energy than America's. But China's military cannot project power into the Persian Gulf the way the U.S. Navy can. So Beijing cannot defend the strait with aircraft carriers, cannot enforce freedom of navigation with destroyer patrols, cannot guarantee access through military supremacy. Instead, China does something more effective. Beijing makes sure the country that controls the strait sees China as a partner, not a threat. Iran gets Chinese investment, Chinese weapons, Chinese diplomatic cover at the UN, Chinese currency swap lines that allow Tehran to bypass dollar-based sanctions. In exchange, Chinese-flagged vessels and Chinese-aligned cargo move through Hormuz without delays, inspections, or costs. The result is a security arrangement more durable than any military alliance. The U.S. Navy can patrol the Gulf with 50 ships. But if Iran decides only Chinese-friendly vessels pass smoothly, American military presence becomes irrelevant. You cannot bomb your way to maritime efficiency. You cannot cruise missile your way to reliable shipping schedules. At some point, economic leverage beats military hardware. Here's the replacement cost comparison that should terrify Pentagon planners. The U.S. maintains continuous carrier presence in the Gulf. One carrier strike group costs $400 million per month to operate. The United States has kept at least one carrier group in or near the Gulf for 38 consecutive years. That's roughly $180 billion in operational costs, not including the ships themselves, not including aircraft, just operating expenses to maintain presence. China's investment in Iran over the last 5 years totals $27 billion. Infrastructure, energy projects, port facilities, weapon systems. For $27 billion, Beijing gets de facto control over who moves through the strait smoothly and who faces inspections, delays, and harassment. The return on investment is not comparable. It's not even close. American taxpayers are funding a military presence that costs 7 times more than China's entire strategic investment in Iran. And the Chinese approach is producing better results. Chinese ships move freely. American-aligned ships face detention. The math is brutal, and it doesn't change by deploying more carriers. Now pull back and look at how this fits the larger pattern China has been building for a decade. Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative is not about charity. It's about creating dependencies. Pakistan gets a port at Gwadar. Sri Lanka gets a port at Hambantota. Djibouti gets a naval base. Greece gets control of Piraeus. Every investment comes with the same condition. When China needs access, these ports stay open. When China needs leverage, these governments remember who built their infrastructure. Iran is the most valuable piece in this network. Not because of oil. China can buy oil from Russia, from Venezuela, from African producers. Iran matters because Iran controls the choke point. And choke points are where empires rise and fall. The British Empire controlled Gibraltar, Suez, Singapore, the Cape. Every major trade route had a British garrison ensuring access. That's how a small island dominated global commerce for 2 centuries. China's building the same system without the garrisons. Instead of military bases, Beijing uses economic dependency. Instead of colonial administration, China offers investment. The goal is identical. Control the choke points. Ensure Chinese commerce flows. Deny that same reliability to competitors. Russia is watching this with deep satisfaction. Every hour of American strategic attention consumed by the Persian Gulf is one less hour focused on Ukraine, on NATO's eastern flank, on Arctic expansion. Moscow does not need to act. Beijing's Hormuz strategy creates the distraction Russia needs without costing the Kremlin a single ruble. And here's the dimension that should concern Washington most. The global south is drawing conclusions. Developing countries looking at this situation see a clear lesson. The United States has the most powerful military in history, but that military cannot guarantee commerce through Hormuz anymore. China has no carrier groups in the Gulf, but Chinese ships move freely while others get detained. Power is shifting from military capacity to economic integration. Brazil is watching. Indonesia is watching. South Africa is watching. They're seeing that aligning with Washington's security framework no longer guarantees economic access. But aligning with Beijing's economic framework guarantees your ships pass through the world's most critical choke points without harassment. That's a more persuasive argument than any White House briefing about shared values. The dollar implications are even more significant. Right now, oil is priced in US dollars. Saudi Arabia sells oil. Buyers pay in dollars. That system creates constant global demand for dollars. It's one of the pillars holding up American financial dominance. But if Saudi Arabia starts accepting yuan for oil sales to China, that pillar cracks. And the pressure is building. China already buys 25% of Saudi oil exports. That's 5 million barrels per day. If Beijing tells Riyadh the price of continued access through Hormuz is yuan-denominated transactions, the Saudis will calculate costs. Lose dollar pricing on 1/4 of exports but guarantee those exports actually reach customers? Or maintain dollar pricing but risk Chinese coordinated delays that make Saudi oil unreliable? The trend lines point one direction. Within 18 months, expect the first major yuan-priced oil contracts between China and Gulf producers. The deals will be described as limited experiments, denominated in yuan but convertible to dollars, just testing new arrangements. But once the infrastructure exists, expansion becomes easy, and every barrel priced in yuan is one less barrel creating dollar demand. What burned into the strategic consciousness this month is not just about ships in a strait. It's about the realization that American military dominance cannot translate into economic control the way it did for 70 years. The U.S. Navy can destroy any fleet on Earth, but it cannot make ships move efficiently through waters controlled by a country that sees China as a more valuable partner than the United States. Here's the prediction, with a clock attached. Within 6 months, at least one major European shipping company will begin paying premiums to ensure cargo moves on Chinese-affiliated vessels through Hormuz. They won't call it tribute. They'll call it insurance. They'll call it risk management. But the mechanism is identical. Pay the power that controls access. And that power is not the United States Navy anymore. Within 12 months, Saudi Arabia announces a WAN clearing facility for oil transactions with China. The announcement will include reassurances that dollar pricing remains standard, but the infrastructure will exist. And infrastructure shapes behavior more than intentions. Within 24 months, at least 3 major Gulf states formally join China's Belt and Road Initiative with port development projects that give Beijing permanent commercial access regardless of U.S. military presence in the region. The American security umbrella will still exist on paper, but the practical dependencies will run through Beijing. Drop your prediction in the comments. Which happens first? The European shipping insurance payments, the Saudi yuan facility, or the Belt and Road port agreements? Tell me, because I read every single one, and the pattern you're seeing might be the pattern that matters most. If this breakdown gave you a framework for understanding what's actually happening in the Gulf, something beyond the surface level coverage that misses the Chinese angle entirely, share this with one person who needs to see how power is shifting in real time, not through battles, through choke points and checkbooks. The next video examines what happens when this same strategy gets applied to the Malacca Strait. The numbers there are even more stark, the implications even more severe. Subscribe so you don't miss it when it drops, because understanding where this goes next is the only way to understand what your economy looks like in 5 years.